In 1773, a Scottish traveler named James Bruce walked out of the Ethiopian highlands, carrying 3 goatskin manuscripts written in a language almost no European could read. Inside those pages was a book that the early Christian church had condemned, hunted, and tried to erase from human memory for more than 1,000 years. The monks of Lake Tana had been quietly copying it by candlelight since the 4th century, hiding it in stone monasteries on islands no foreign army ever reached. Tonight, we are going to look at exactly what is inside those forbidden pages, why every major church council voted to bury them, and why a small group of Ethiopian monks risked everything to keep them alive. The man who brought those manuscripts back was not a clergyman. James Bruce of Kinnaird was a Scottish laird, a wine merchant, a former consul to Algiers, and one of the most physically imposing travelers of the 18th century. He stood 6'4" in an era when the average European man was a foot shorter. He spoke Arabic, Ge'ez, Amharic, and a working amount of Tigrinya. He had spent 6 years inside Ethiopia, from 1769 to 1774, surviving dysentery, civil war, and a court so volatile that the previous European visitor had been executed for sport. When Bruce finally returned to France in March of 1773, he carried with him 3 authentic copies of a text known in Ethiopia as Mashafa Enoch, the Book of Enoch. He gave 1 copy to King Louis XV, which still sits in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. He gave a 2nd copy to the Bodleian Library at Oxford. He kept the 3rd for himself, and it eventually made its way to Oxford as well. 3 manuscripts, all written in Ge'ez, all preserved by Ethiopian monks for roughly 1,400 years, while the rest of Christendom believed the book had been lost forever. For most viewers, this is the part of the story that does not make sense. Because if you grew up in any Western Christian tradition, Catholic, Protestant, Greek Orthodox, you were taught a very specific version of how the Bible came together. You were told that a council of bishops carefully sorted the inspired writings from the false ones. You were told the canon was settled, debated openly, and accepted by every legitimate church. The official version is that the Book of Enoch was simply not authentic, that it was a late edition, and that it was excluded for good and obvious reasons. That is the official version. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church never received the memo. The Ethiopian Church kept Enoch inside its Bible, not as an appendix, not as a footnote, as scripture sitting in the same canonical list as Genesis, Exodus, and the Psalms. Their full canon contains 81 books, more than any other Christian tradition on earth. And the monks who guarded those manuscripts at places like the Abba Garima Monastery in the Tigray region were not unaware of the rest of the Christian world. They knew Rome had rejected Enoch. They knew the Greek-speaking churches had rejected it. They simply did not agree. And they had a reason. The reason has to do with a single line in the New Testament. In the small letter known as the Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15, the author quotes directly from the Book of Enoch by name. The quotation is exact. It matches chapter 1, verse 9 of the Ethiopian text almost word for word. For the Ethiopian monks, this settled the matter. If the Apostle Jude, brother of James and reportedly half-brother of Jesus, was quoting Enoch as authoritative scripture in the 1st century, then Enoch was scripture. Full stop. That is how the manuscripts survived, not by accident, by stubborn, deliberate refusal to throw them out. To understand why the rest of the church wanted Enoch buried, you have to read what is actually in it. And this is where the story stops being a footnote in church history and starts becoming something else entirely. Because the Book of Enoch does not read like the rest of the Old Testament. It does not sound like Genesis. It does not sound like Isaiah. It reads like a first-person account of someone being taken on a guided tour of places that should not exist. The book opens with the patriarch Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, describing in plain language a group of beings he calls the Watchers. According to the text, 200 of these Watchers descended onto the summit of Mount Hermon, on what is now the border between Lebanon and Syria, in the days before the flood. They were not vague spiritual figures. They had names. 20 of them are listed: Samyaza, the leader; Azazel, who taught humans to forge swords and shields; Armoros, who taught the resolving of enchantments; Barakijal, who taught astrology; Kokabel, who taught the constellations; Penamu, who taught the use of ink and paper. Each one is given a specific area of forbidden knowledge that he allegedly transferred to humanity: metallurgy, cosmetics, warfare, astronomy, pharmacology. The text does not present this as metaphor, it presents it as history. Then it gets stranger. The Watchers, according to Enoch, took human wives, and the offspring of those unions were called the Nephilim, a Hebrew word that appears in Genesis chapter 6 but is never explained there. In Genesis, you get 1.5 verses about the Nephilim, and the text moves on. In Enoch, you get chapter after chapter. The Nephilim are described as giants of enormous size who consumed all the food humans could produce, then turned on humanity itself. The text gives their height in cubits. It describes the corruption of the earth that followed. And it presents the flood of Noah not as punishment for ordinary human sin, but as a deliberate cleansing operation aimed at the bloodline of the Watchers and their hybrid descendants. This is the version of pre-flood history that Ethiopian monks have been reading every Sunday for 1600 years. It is also the version that Tertullian, the 2nd century North African church father, defended in writing. It is the version that the Epistle of Jude quotes directly. It is the version that fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in 1947 confirmed had been circulating among Jewish communities at least 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. Aramaic copies of Enoch were among the very first texts the Qumran scribes copied. They considered it important enough to preserve in multiple manuscripts, case closed, on paper. Except the manuscripts kept telling more. The deeper sections of the book are where the trouble really starts. There is a section called the Book of the Watchers, which describes Enoch being lifted up and taken on a journey through the earth and the heavens. He describes a mountain of fire that burns day and night without consuming itself. He describes a deep abyss with pillars of heavenly fire, where the fallen watchers are bound and held until a final day of judgment. He describes a tree whose fragrance fills the entire region around it, with fruit no human is permitted to touch until a specific future moment. He describes the geography of the dead. He says the souls of the deceased are held in 4 hollow places inside a great mountain in the west, separated by their conduct in life, awaiting resurrection. The description is detailed. It includes the slope of the chambers, the presence of bright water, and the specific angel, Raphael, who showed him the layout. Then comes the section called the Astronomical Book, and this is the part that genuinely unsettled early modern scholars when they finally translated it in 1821. Because in the Astronomical Book, Enoch describes a 364-day solar calendar with extraordinary precision. He describes the gates through which the sun rises and sets across the year. He describes the phases of the moon, the lengths of the seasons, and the precise rhythm of the equinoxes. The astronomy is not perfect by modern standards, but it is far more advanced than anything else attributed to the pre-exilic Hebrew tradition. Some researchers, including the Oxford scholar Matthew Black in his 1985 commentary, observed that elements of the Enochic calendar align with Mesopotamian astronomical records that the patriarch Enoch could not plausibly have accessed through any conventional channel. If you have never heard any of this before, take a second right now and hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of buried history we go deep on every single week on this channel. The kind that does not get taught in any Sunday school and almost never makes it into a textbook. We are only halfway through what those Ethiopian monks were guarding. The next section is called the Book of Parables, and this is the section that almost certainly sealed Enoch's fate at the hands of the early church. In the Book of Parables, Enoch describes a figure he calls the Son of Man. He describes him sitting on a throne of glory. He describes him as the chosen one, hidden from the foundation of the world, revealed only at the end of days. He describes him judging the kings of the earth, the mighty, and those who possess the dry land. The language is uncomfortably specific. It overlaps in places almost word for word with the way Jesus describes himself in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. The phrase Son of Man, which Jesus uses of himself more than 80 times in the New Testament, appears in the Book of Parables in a context that predates the Gospels by at least a century. Some scholars, including the late James Vanderkam at the University of Notre Dame, have argued that Jesus was not inventing a new title when he called himself the Son of Man. He was reaching back into a body of Jewish literature his audience already knew. He was reaching back into Enoch. This is the kind of claim that makes a 4th century bishop nervous, because if Enoch is genuine prophecy, then the Gospels are quoting it, the Apostle Jude is quoting it, and the Church has no clean way to declare it heretical without unraveling part of its own foundation. But if Enoch is allowed to stand as Scripture, then every reader can see for themselves the story of the Watchers, the Nephilim, the cosmic geography, the bound spirits in the abyss. And the controlled, simplified version of pre-flood history in Genesis becomes one of 2 competing accounts. The early church chose to control the narrative. The Council of Laodicea, sometime around the year 363, issued a list of approved scriptures. Enoch was not on it. Athanasius of Alexandria, in his festal letter of 367, listed the books of the Bible as he wanted them remembered. Enoch was not on it. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the City of God in the early 5th century, acknowledged that Enoch contained genuinely ancient material but argued that it could not be trusted because, in his view, it was too old and too damaged to verify. He recommended setting it aside, Across the Mediterranean, copies began to disappear. Greek manuscripts were not recopied. Latin translations were never made. Within roughly 200 years, the Book of Enoch had vanished from the libraries of every major Christian center, from Rome to Constantinople to Antioch to Alexandria. By the medieval period, European scholars knew Enoch only by name, only through the single quotation in Jude and through scattered references in the writings of the early fathers. The book itself was treated as lost, except in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Church had been baptized into Christianity in the 4th century, around the year 330, under King Ezana of the Aksumite Empire. The Bible was translated into Ge'ez almost immediately, and Enoch was translated along with it. The mountains of northern Ethiopia, the islands of Lake Tana, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, became a sealed reservoir. Three things protected those manuscripts: the geography, which kept invading armies out; the language, which kept Western scholars from understanding what was being preserved; and the monks themselves, who took vows that bound them to the copying and protection of the texts for life. The Garima Gospels, kept at the Abba Garima Monastery in Tigray, were carbon dated by Oxford researchers between 2010 and 2013. The dating placed them between the years 330 and 650, making them very likely the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts on earth. Not in Rome, not in Constantinople. In a small monastery in the Ethiopian highlands that almost no Western tourist had ever visited. That is the broader context for what James Bruce walked out of Ethiopia with in 1773. He was not discovering something new. He was simply the first European in roughly 1,000 years to physically retrieve a complete copy and bring it back to a place where it could be translated. The first English translation, by the Oxford scholar Richard Laurence, was not published until 1821. By that time, Bruce had been dead for 27 years. When Lawrence's translation appeared, the response in European theological circles was, according to most accounts, quiet. Strangely quiet. There was no public debate, no formal church response, no widespread controversy in the press. The book was treated as a curiosity, an apocryphal oddity from a remote corner of Africa. It took another century and the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery in 1947 before mainstream scholarship was forced to take Enoch seriously as a genuinely ancient Jewish text. Today, you can buy a translated copy of the Book of Enoch on any major bookstore website for around $15. The Ethiopian Church still holds it as scripture. The Bodleian still holds Bruce's manuscripts in a controlled climate vault. The fragments from Qumran still sit in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The original cover-up, if you want to call it that, is over. But the questions the book raises have never been answered. Who or what were the Watchers? Why does an obscure Jewish text from roughly 300 BCE describe astronomy that aligns with Mesopotamian records? Why does the Epistle of Jude quote it as scripture? Why did Jesus, according to the Gospels, use language that mirrors phrasing from a book his contemporaries would have known, but that the Church would later reject? And why, in particular, did one small group of Ethiopian monks, isolated for centuries on islands and mountaintops, refuse to let it die when every other branch of Christianity had agreed to forget it? There is one detail I want to leave you with. In 2018, researchers from the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Minnesota completed a digitization project of Ethiopian Orthodox manuscripts that had never been photographed before. The collection ran into the tens of thousands of pages. Buried in that archive were variant copies of Enoch with passages and verses that do not appear in the Bruce manuscripts. The same ones translated by Laurence in 1821, the same ones every modern English edition is based on. Some of those passages are still being studied. Some have not been fully translated into English yet. Which raises the obvious question. If the version of Enoch you can buy on a bookstore website today is based on 3 manuscripts a Scottish wine merchant brought home in 1773, and there are now thousands of Ethiopian manuscripts that no Western scholar has fully read, what else is sitting in those monastery libraries that we still have not seen? That is the question I want you to answer in the comments.